All right, and welcome back. So let's talk today about North American art and archaeology. So when we talk about North American art and archaeology, we're essentially talking everything north of Mexico. Yes, I know those people in the comments who want to point out that Mexico is part of North America. But from the perspective of archaeology and art history, Mexico is lumped in with Mesoamerica and not with North America. So when we talk about North American archaeology, we're talking about the continental United States, Canada, Alaska, those places, and then some of the affiliated islands. We've already talked a little bit about the origins of where people come from in the New World, and so we don't have to talk so much about that. But we are going to talk a little bit about the Archaic period, because that's when we start seeing the development of the Mound Builders at Poverty Point. And then everything breaks down very similar to the way Mesoamerican chronology is broken down. You have the formative period, the classical period, and the post-classical period. Those dates are actually kind of interesting, because the classical period for Mesoamerican archaeology, for example, is pretty much ended up at the year 900, and then by that time we're into the post-classical period. So these dates are similar, but they're shifted. So North America gets the later start of any of the civilizations. So if you remember, South America has the oldest civilization in the New World, the Norte Chico civilization in Peru, which goes all the way back to 3000 BCE. That's just staggering. Go 1,000 years forward, and then you get the Olmec, which are the next oldest. But the formative period in North America is going to be much, much later. So it's going to be this period that if we were talking Mesoamerican, it would be classic period. All right, well, that's enough throat clearing. The biggest culture that we're going to talk about is going to be the Mound Builders. So named because they built mounds. The imagination of archaeologists, I can't tell you. Who could have come up with that? I never could have. Anyhow, so the ingenious people who name these cultures call them mound builders, largely because they built mounds. And we're talking about two primary cultures, the Hopewell culture and the Mississippi culture. And they all have some recognizable features. They have large ceremonial centers, mounds, obviously, wooden stockades, and palisades. That's one thing that's really interesting comparing their civilizations to Mesoamerican civilizations, is that Mesoamerican civilizations did not have fortified cities. I guess Tenochtitlan was, because it was built in the middle of a lake. But for the most part, fortifications don't exist in the Mayan zone, but every single one of these cities has a wooden palisade around it. It's kind of interesting. Derive of that from the culture what you will. They don't use stone architecture, so we don't see pyramids or stone or large monuments, and this is kind of why we don't think of the Mississippi culture as significant as, say, the Maya or the Mexican Basin cultures. This is just an accident of history. However, you go to the Han Dynasty. The Han Dynasty is every bit as big as the Roman Empire, maybe even bigger. But because most of what they built was built in wood, it didn't survive. So there isn't a lot surviving of Han architecture. Same thing could be said of the West African empires. Most of what they built was built in wood, and it didn't survive. So because all we have are the mounds left, there's not a lot of big fancy buildings to look at, and that sometimes makes us think that these are less significant cultures. But as we go on, we'll see that these were actually very significant cultures. There were lots of these cities, lots of these urban environments, and some of them, like Cahokia, may have been as big as 50,000 people. That's not a small place in the pre-contact world. So let's start right from the beginning. So our earliest site is the archaic Indian site at Poverty Point. This is the earliest major mound that exists in the United States today. Louisiana Route 577 goes right through the center of it today, but it's a series of concentric mounds built around a ceremonial courtyard, and then at the back there is Mound A, which is gotta grab my pen, right here, and it's not only one of the first major mounds, it's one of the largest mounds ever built. This is what it looks like today. Here's a kind of recreation of what it would have looked like. Now, Mound A is one of the largest mounds out there. It's 72 feet high, 710 feet long, and 660 feet wide. just to give you a sense of that footprint, it's not nearly as tall as the pyramids at Giza, but the footprint there is as big as the footprint as the pyramids at Giza. So quite a substantial construction. Here's what it would have looked like when it was new. It's, of course, eroded and slumped a great deal since then. Now, one of the things that's most fascinating about this site is that when it was first discovered, they knew that this culture was pre-agriculture. The people who built this are hunter-gatherers. Corn and agriculture hadn't quite reached this part of the world yet. And so they assumed that this thing was built over a long period of time. You could tell through archaeology, through strata, exactly how many layers something has, because you build one layer in a season, then it rains, this washes pollens down, and this produces a debris layer or a very thin kind of boundary layer. Then the next layer builds on top of it, and you can clearly see those in the soil when you're excavating. But when they excavated this, not too long ago, they did a big test dig, and they discovered that there was only a single layer, which means that the mound was built in one season, in basically 1 year. Building a mound of this size in 1 year means that you have to have thousands of people dedicated to building it. And this totally just throws our ideas of how societies get started on their head. So as a Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you have food and sustenance at the bottom, and then you get the higher needs, which are things like, self-actualization, psychological needs. And what's interesting is that the archaeology is proving that that's a kind of bunk. We used to think that it took agriculture before you could have complex stratified societies. But a site like this is a lot like a lot of sites being discovered all over the world that discovers that we were building temples and we were building sacred sites that showed social hierarchies and social stratification centuries before we had actually figured out agriculture. That the most important things, the big motivators in our life, are going to be religion, society, and this is what caused us to come together. And then when we were all together, it's like, geez, it's kind of hard to feed all these people just by hunting and gathering. Why don't we invent agriculture? So agriculture comes after culture, not the other way around. It's really kind of fascinating. So we see that right there from the earliest phases, 1300 BC in some cases, we have very sophisticated cultures building mounds. And so mounds are going to be a major feature of these cultures going forward. The next major period is going to be the Hopewell culture. The Hopewell culture is named for the Hopewell Mountains, which are there in the Ohio River Valley system. And there's a large number of these cultures. They were probably not one culture. They were probably connected by trade, and they probably had ethnic and religious similarities, but they were probably distinct cultures. In fact, we don't even know if the Hopewell, the Ohio Hopewell, was a single culture. So you shouldn't think of these as nation states. You should think of them more as kind of independent ceremonial centers or city, states within that. But all up and down the Mississippi and Ohio River Valley, we see mound builders of one type or another. And one of the earliest groups, of course, are the Hopewell group, so named for the Hopewell Mounds. These are the Hopewell Mounds. And this gives you a sense of how difficult archaeology is in North America, because there isn't a lot of material culture. There isn't the pyramids or the rocks or the etc. If you're building in mounds, they're not going to hold up very well. And to a lot of early settlers and researchers, these just look like low-lying hills. These things exist in river valleys. If you have a river flood, it can throw up an earthen berm, and it's very hard to tell some of these from actual intentional mounds. In fact, I've been told a story, I don't know which campus it was, but there was a campus in the University of Tennessee system that was building a new building back in the 90s, and they actually dug into a hill thinking it was just a hill, and they got halfway through it and they were like, oh my gosh, it's a mound, and discovered that it was an intentionally built mound, and they had to have a bunch of people come, and archaeologists, to try to rescue what they had stumbled into. And they're all over the eastern United States. But as people started clearing the land, it's important to know that all of these have been completely covered with forest and vegetation, have been abandoned for centuries before European settlers started excavating them. And it was only then that they realized, holy crap, this is some kind of civilization. The characteristics that identify them, such as the Hopewell Mound, is that you're going to have a large central ceremonial mound. You're going to have a trench. That is, you dig up the earth on one side and heap it up on the other. And this is some kind of boundary, a defensive trench. And then there's going to be several smaller subsidiary mounds that are probably individual burial mounds strewn throughout the entire site. So when we look at the Hopewell Mound sites here, you can see there's not very much to look at. It looks kind of like a golf course, but you can see that this is the exterior wall. So what we have is we have a trench. What they would do is dig the earth here, throw it up in a mound here, and then this would have been, lined with a palisade of a wooden stockade. So they would have been defensible cities or kind of citadels. Now, most of the people probably lived outside of these, but the ceremonial center was inside. In times of need, they would come in, just like medieval fortresses or castles. But a lot of these are very highly eroded, and so they're nowhere near the size they once were. And this is a pattern that we see everywhere. There's lots of these, kind of a large central ceremonial mound, smaller subsidiary mounds that are probably going to be, individual funerary mounds, and then a palisade that goes all the way around that has a moat or a trench, and then kind of few open spots for people to come through. They're narrow defensive areas. One of the more prominent ones is the Newark Mounds. Here is the Newark Mounds as it looks today, and here's the plan of the Newark Mounds. Now, the Newark Mounds in Newark, Ohio, not Newark, New Jersey, are very significant because in addition to having all of these mounds, they have several very identifiable characteristics that are connected by causeways. These are causeways that have a mound, a kind of, path on either side is a raised mound, so that there's definitely something connecting what appears to be the main settlement with other areas that seem to be purely ceremonial. The most important is going to be this one, the octagon out here. Here's what this kind of looks like in a reconstruction, all of these low mounds that would have defined these kind of sacred areas. And again, there's not much there today to look at. You can see the low mounds that exist. Because some of them are so straight or so aligned, you can tell that they are definitely man-made. But the octagon is probably the most significant because everybody believes that this is an archaeoastronomical site. A archaeoastronomical site is a site that was used to define and monitor astronomical events. So things like the rising of the sun, the moon, etc. This one is really interesting. A couple of researchers by the name of Ray Hively and Robert Horn from Earlman College discovered that there were a number of astronomical alignments, particularly related to the moon, that if you sighted from one particular mound, such as this, to the edge of the circle, this would give you the maximum southern moon set, and then all of the rest followed suit in that direction. And this showed that not only did they know the moon's movements, but there is an 18.6-year-long cycle of the moon. The moon, of course, doesn't orbit in a purely flat orbit. It has a quite bizarre orbit, and this repeats in an 18.6-year cycle. A quite bizarre orbit. Yeah, get me out of astronomy science. I'm an art historian, damn it. What do you expect? Darn it, Jim, I'm an art historian, not an astronomer. I don't understand it. But smart people who do tell me it's way cool. I have a brother-in-law. He's an astronomer at UVU. I should just insert him at this point. So there are, really sophisticated measurements going that showed that they understood their environment and had some kind of calendar system. Unfortunately, they don't leave any writing or any kind of other things behind, so it's hard for us to evaluate. The most famous mound of all the Hopewell period mounds is going to be the Serpent Mound. So the Serpent Mound dates to somewhere around the year 1070 CE, and it has an elaborate series of mounds that snake back and forth over the landscape. One side appears to have a head that is swallowing an egg-like form. That's interesting. The other end ends in a spiral. These are all, again, very heavily eroded today, but we know that this was built over a long period of time, that the first mounds were actually very small and contained burials, then the mounds became expanded over time. So these appear to be dynastic structures as well as astronomical structures. They're not just meant to measure certain events, they are there to honor chieftains, shamans, nobles, elites. when we look at the mound, there are a number of astronomical alignments. That snake head eating the egg-like form points right in the direction of the summer solstice, which has led some people to suggest that this is some kind of myth of a serpent eating a sun, or something like that. The bends themselves mark out the various important points of the moon rise and moon set. So very sophisticated for the time. When we get into the finds inside of these mounds, we have a number of different finds, and the three big finds are going to be mica votives, copper repousé ornaments, and effigy pipes. Effigy pipes are the classic defining feature of Hopewell culture. So let's talk about the mica votives. These are objects that are intentionally buried as some kind of devotion either to the dead or to the gods, and they're made out of thin sheets of mica. Mica is a naturally existing mineral. It has a metallic luster. It's a very beautiful mineral, but it's very fragile and exists in pure thin sheets. But they would tool these sheets into very, very precise votives. And so here you have a mica hand. Here you have a claw of a bird of prey with these terrifying talons. And sometimes you have things like this serpent. So this is I know it looks like aluminum foil, it looks like a metallic sheet, but it's actually a naturally existing mineral. The other thing that we have is copper. Now, it's often thought that people in the North American zone did not have metalworking skills. Turns out that they did. But unlike Mesoamerica and South America, where they had figured out how to smelt and mine metals, they did not seem to have the knowledge of how to smelt copper. So rather what we're seeing here is copper sheets that are hammered out of copper nuggets. So if you've ever seen those old-time Western movies where a guy goes panning for gold nuggets in a stream, well, you can pan for copper nuggets too. And in fact, the Great Lakes region is full of these things. There's lots of copper nodules and nuggets that exist in and around the river systems in that part of the world, and people would trade them into the interior, and they would take those copper nuggets and hammer them, and by cold hammering them, hammer them into these beautiful ornaments. The ornaments take the shape of falcons. You can always recognize the peregrine falcon as it's being very important because it's this dramatic cheek marking. And these either would have been votives or they would have been ornaments for pectorals. Pectorals are, of course, large, kind of necklaces that you hang around your neck that hang over your pecs, hence pectorals. They hang in front of your chest. That's a fashion trend we got to bring back. And they really were quite elaborate. Others look like axe heads. This looks like a kind of stone axe head, but it has an animal paw inside of it. And this one is just some kind of disc. So these are very well crafted items, and we do find a number of these. Relatively rare. The preeminent Hopewell artifact, however, is the effigy pipe. And here we have to pause and talk a little bit about tobacco. So tobacco was harvested by all New World cultures, but it was particularly important among North American cultures. So while we do know that the Mesoamericans smoked and used tobacco, they made cigars, they invented cigars and smoking, it was not used as ritually as it was in North American cultures. And so in North American cultures, tobacco was used in almost all blessings and spiritual, devotions and offerings. It was very common that, you would smoke a pipe and you would pass the smoke over the top of you. You would blow the smoke over people to bless them. You would blow the smoke into all four directions to bless the four cardinal directions, etc. And so it was the preeminent, ritual agricultural product in the North American zone. And this continues to be true right up until the present day. Tobacco is a very important ritual feature of many Native American traditions. In fact, it was so important that it actually crossed traditions between tribes. There's this wonderful kind of anecdote that comes out of the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War is one of the worst named wars in history, because the war was actually not between the French and Indians, it was between the French and the British. But both the French and the British had Native American allies and guides and auxiliaries on both sides. And there's a very famous story that the French, were sent their, Native American allies and to go combat the British Native American allies on this one occasion. And one of the Native American tribes decided to pull out a pipe and start smoking tobacco. And so sacred was the nature of tobacco that it immediately stopped the fight, and both tribes kind of gathered together and smoked their pipes together and had a little ritual, much to the consternation of the Europeans. The Europeans, of course, saw this as, a fraternization amongst the enemy. But for the Native Americans, it meant, no, this was so sacred that even in context of war, the ritual had to be honored. And this is where the so-called traditions of the so-called peace pipe come from, that the pipe was so revered. And so the pipe and smoking and things associated with smoking tobacco were very, very sacred artifacts. And this is a very, very old tradition. And you can see it in these beautiful, beautiful effigy pipes. So many people think these are ceramic, but they're not. They're actually carved out of stone. They're carved out of a kind of stone that is called pipestone. So I give archaeologists a lot of crap. I guess I got to give the geologists crap. And the stone is known by the mineral name catlinite. And catlinite is found in very few places in the world. In fact, it's found in the upper Midwest. There's red and black catlinite, red and white, black and green pipestone. There is Pipestone National Monument, which I think is in Minnesota. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. And most of the red pipestone across all of the eastern United States came from that one location. It's really quite amazing. Pipestone is very soft to carve. I had a student who actually carved a pipe out of pipestone for me, and it's just beautiful stuff. It's smoother, it's warm to the touch, it's smoother than soapstone and softer too. Carves like butter, takes detail very beautifully. Gorgeous material. And so you can understand why it was so highly prized and why they sought out for it. As a matter of fact, if the only people who are allowed to mine at the quarries at Pipestone National Monument are people who have Native American heritage. If you do not have Native American heritage, you are not allowed to do it. You are not allowed to use it. It's a limited cultural resource. There are new sources of catlinite, and they are all from Utah. It's interesting. Utah is just a geologist's dream. Oh my gosh, every mineral in the world is here. And so there are sources of catlinite that have been discovered in Utah, and so those have managed to ease the strain on the supply. And I've always wanted to get a chunk and just carve it because it's just gorgeous stuff. All right, well, enough about catlinite. So this very rare, very precious material to them was used to carve these pipes, and they have this very characteristic form. You can't quite see it in this beautifully carved raven, but it's a little bit easier to see in this beaver. This beaver even has inlaid mother of pearl eyes, but you can see that there is a hole or a bowl in the back. And this is attached to the pipette, which is a small little narrow hole that is here. So you have a bowl here that would be placed with tobacco, and then you would smoke it from this side. And so the bowl is carved into this beautiful, effigy. Some suggest that you would smoke directly from this. Other evidence is that they would have like a little reed that they would use as a mouthpiece. But either way, the fact that they would spend so much care and attention on these pipes shows how this was a very sacred thing. This is a very high prestige sacred thing to be smoking tobacco. And so beautiful effigy pipes and just incredible artistic quality. Here's an owl effigy pipe, beautiful little thing with the owl's head turned around the other side. It's interesting that the figures of the effigies face the person who is smoking. So that seems to be a characteristic of all these, that the effigy is directing its attention towards the person who is smoking. So even though this owl is facing this way, its head is turned around towards the person who's smoking because there's the hole. We find literally hundreds of these inside these mound sites. In fact, this is a display case from the Tremper Mound Museum. And the Tremper Mound Museum, there were over 500 objects, of which, something, I think I've got it in my notes, 136 were pipestone effigy pipes. So 136 effigy pipes just in this one mound complex. Really amazing. And every kind of animal imaginable. Frogs, badgers, almost all of these are going to be animals that are known from the region. I love this one. I wish I had a better detail of this one. This one is a heron with its, bill down as if it's plucking something out of it. But my all-time favorite one is this one. Oh my gosh, it's just so adorable. So you have an otter. He has this little fish in his mouth. There you can see the hole in his back. It would have held the tobacco. What's interesting about these is that how few of them are actually intact. We have a few of them that are intact, but of the hundreds of effigy pipes that we found, the vast majority of them have been broken, and intentionally broken. You can see that this one was intentionally broken into two pieces. It was broken through here and broken through the pipe bowl itself. So even though this is such a nice, beautiful stone, it's a very relatively soft stone and could be easily just snap it in your hands. And it appears that this was done intentionally. That shows how important the ritual of pipe smoking was to their culture, that the pipe was very much identified with the individual. So when the individual was buried in the mound, his pipe was broken and buried with him so that it could never be used again, so that it was highly identified with the individual. And so it was this kind of ritual practice, the ceremonial killing of the pipe. And it's possible that these effigies, almost in certainty, had very strong kind of shamanistic qualities, that they may have represented. I know a spirit animal is a little bit of a cliche, but individual totems or animals to the individuals themselves who possess them. Really gorgeous things. Beautiful, beautiful. Okay. Well, that will bring us to the later Mississippi culture. So the Hopewell culture is the kind of formative to classic period, and then the classic to post-classic period is going to be the Mississippi culture. These two are also mound builders. And unlike the Hopewell, where we can only kind of guess at their culture, their religion, we actually do know a little bit about these individuals' culture, religion. After all, a lot of the eastern woodland Indians that survived after European contact and the pandemics are the descendants of these cultures. So, for example, a lot of the myths of the Ojibwe, also of the Monodoc and Winnebago Native Americans. Yes, Winnebago is actually a tribe, not a RV. All of these cultures have very similar cultural myths of characters such as Redhorn, Hero Twins, etc. We'll talk a little bit more about these. And the iconography of the objects that we find in Mississippi culture seems to align with these cultures. So that makes sense. So we can actually reconstruct this. And we call this the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, or SECC. And the early Mississippi period is, up to about the year 1200 CE. The middle Mississippi, and then the late Mississippi period is the period till just past contact. So we actually know some about these cultures because of a couple of Spanish expeditions. So in 1528 to 1532, Navarez leaves Santo Domingo. He travels through Cuba and eventually makes his way across the southeastern United States. It's a disastrous expedition. He eventually stumbles into Mexico City. Another second expedition happens a little bit later in 1539, 1542. This is the Hernando de Soto, the very famous Hernando de Soto explorer expedition. This is the expedition that actually results in Hernando de Soto's death, and he ends up dying on the banks of the Mississippi River because of this. So he has a series of expeditions across the southeast. He was there to make allies and made enemies just as often. Eventually he ends up dying, and his men go down the Mississippi River and flee down the coast to Mexico in a very distressed state. But like all of these, they ended up searching for gold, but what they tell us is really quite amazing. They describe cities, actual cities, surrounded by palisades and with ceremonial mounds, cities of thousands of people. These cultures, the Mississippi culture, used the rivers for their highways, and so they actually, in many places, dammed the rivers or cleared out weeds from the rivers so that they could get canoes both war canoes and trading canoes. And they would lash, these huge 20-foot canoes together into large barges, and they would go up and down the Mississippi River all the way to the headwaters of the Mississippi, all the way down to Louisiana to make trades, and then up all of the rivers. And so it was really a quite significant culture. And he identified many different tribes, and unfortunately burned a few of them down. But this is evidence of a very, very large, very, very sophisticated culture. It's I remember one time I had a professor talk to me. He said, you go down to the library and go to the section on Maya, and there's 100 books on the Maya. We've been writing about the Maya for a couple hundred years now. There's lots of archaeological evidence. There's inscriptions. You can talk about the Maya. But you go to the shelf on the Mississippi culture, and there's maybe 1 or 2 books. That's because they just disappeared. And not only they just disappear because they built things out of wood and wattle and daub, that doesn't survive nearly as well as the limestone and basalt pyramids, so they become a lost civilization. There's been something of a revision in thinking regarding the Mississippi culture. It used to be regarded that they were a relatively minor, they had cities, strung out across the river, but they were relatively minor culture with not much in the way of economics or power. But now people are beginning to suspect that they may have been as big or as dynamic as the cultures in Mesoamerica. I expect big and exciting things to happen. It's funny, we use LiDAR and all of this, jungle penetrating technology and to find these lost cities of the Maya. But what we really need to do is to do a major reassessment of the United States, and particularly the eastern United States, and see if we can't recreate it. Of course, the population of the United States makes it very, very hard to do that. All of this is private land, and a lot of it has since been overgrown or plowed under, but it's a great loss. So we have, again, a number of sites, all of them spread up around the Mississippi River in the southeastern United States. Very significant cultures, large settlements. The largest seems to be Cahokia, which is right here. This is modern-day Illinois, but it was a major center, and its high point would have been somewhere around 800 to 1400 CE. We have large pyramidal mounds, ceremonial centers, marketplaces, a wood henge, that's very important, we'll get back to that, a chunky playing ground, we'll talk about that, and also evidence of mass burial and sacrifice. So here's a reconstruction of what we think Cahokia would have been like. It again had a palisaded stockade, it had a grand plaza in the center of it, a massive ceremonial mound, but it was far more than that. It was had a huge causeway that went right through the heart of the city, and this causeway goes for several miles in both directions, and it connects large populations and villages together. Notice this is our wood henge down here. We'll come and talk about it. At the very center we have Monk's Mound. Monk's Mound is, again, one of the largest earth structures ever created in the world. It's over 100 feet high, it's 1,000 feet long, and it's over 700 feet wide. That makes it larger than the footprint of the Great Pyramid, and that also makes it larger than the pyramid at Teotihuacan. That's pretty impressive. It's nowhere near as high as those because it's made out of mostly soil and clay, and they did know what they were doing. They did know that water saturates down into the soil and causes the building to slump, and so what they did is they would take a layer of packed earth and cover it with clay to kind of divert the water so that it didn't soak up the water so much. But it's Illinois, it's pretty wet. The groundwater is pretty high, and so it has slumped a great deal. So it probably was a lot taller in its initial creation, maybe 20, 30 feet taller than it currently is. It's slumped and eroded quite a bit, but there's evidence that it was slumping even when they were building it, and they knew that, and they tried to shore it up. It would have just been a massive edifice standing out over this central courtyard. Now, as far as mounds are concerned, mounds and pyramids are most often temples in the Mesoamerican zone. But these appear to be both temples and residences. So these are places that a chieftain would reside. And so the chieftain probably had a quasi-religious function. He probably lived up there and also maintained the chief religious functions of the city itself. So you can see that it has this kind of stepped quality. It had a large platform out in front, which again was a ceremonial platform. Here is another reconstruction of it, which shows these kind of tiered platforms. And we can tell that from many of these platforms that there are whole layers to them. They are built very similar to the Mesoamerican pyramids, that you have an earthen mound, and the wooden structure built above is not preserved because it's very hard to preserve these. But there's evidence that they would expand upon these and continue to build large structures above. Structures would have been made out of wood and had wattle and daub walls. Wattle and daub is where you have a woven wood, almost like a basket, kind of exterior that is then covered in thick layers of adobe, what we call adobe or mud brick, but it wouldn't have been mud brick. It would have just been smeared cob. Cob is the correct term. Wake up, Trav! I just went off coke. Give me a break. I'm trying to lose some weight. Anyhow, so they would have been covered what we call cob, this mixture of earth and clay and vegetable matter, and then smoothed over and plastered smooth, and then would have had thatched roofs. Probably the biggest evidence of how sophisticated their building and their understanding is Woodhenge. So we don't know Woodhenge except for the post holes that were dug. So this was made out of wooden posts, but the posts would have, of course, long since rotted away before anybody got there. But when you dig a hole, you pack the earth down around the hole, and you can tell where the hole was. And so we reconstructed the Woodhenge, and the Woodhenge, again, was an astronomical calendar. It was made for astronomical observances. It is just to one side of this massive rattlesnake causeway, and it is more accurate in its predictions of the solstices and the various astronomical events than Stonehenge is, the very famous Stonehenge. So a lot of encoded astronomical knowledge. And obviously this meant that there was a great deal of association of their culture with the astronomical phenomenon as well. We know from their culture that there was a belief that the heavens kind of represented a permanent world, the middle world was kind of a world of chaos, and the underworld was beneath it, and the middle world was connected to the other worlds by a kind of axis mundi, a pole, kind of like a world tree, but not quite exactly the same. So Woodhenge itself was the site of some very important constructions in the later phase, and eventually they abandoned the poles and built a series of mounds. So this is Mound 72. Mound 72 had two smaller mounds, and they kind of joined them together to one larger mound. And this is the mound that they would make most of their sightings off of. When Mound 72 was excavated, there was a large burial found underneath, and a cache of arrowheads and other sacred artifacts in great abundance. Literally hundreds of these incredibly well-crafted arrowheads. And this is the first major evidence of this level of human sacrifice in the Mississippi realm. It used to be assumed that, again, human sacrifice was known in North America amongst Native American tribes, but it was very, very rare. Europeans describe human sacrifice, but it's very, very rare. It only happens on extraordinarily rare occasions, when there is a famine, a drought, a plague, the death of a king, something that was serious happened. And it was not a daily occurrence for most Native American cultures. So the assumption was that these earlier Mississippi cultures wouldn't have had large numbers of human sacrifice either. Of course, that turns out not to be the case. Over 270 bodies were located in this grave. Most of them were female, and they were locals, and by their teeth and their bone density we can tell that they had very good diets, which means they were probably elites. And so then the question becomes, are they killing their own people? Are these nobles who are sacrificing their lives willingly? We know that happened in the Mesoamerican sphere, so that's possible. Or are they prisoners of war? Are they people who are elites from other nations or other cities nearby that are being given in tribute? That's certainly possible as well. 39 were male warriors, and these weren't laid out neatly. These warriors had massive violent damage to their bodies, and so they seem to have been evidence of gladiatorial sacrifice, that they were killed in ritual combat. So it's really quite extensive. Now, the 270 bodies weren't done all at one time. They were done over a long period of time. But one feature in Mound 72 had 24 bodies, so at least, that was done. Another feature done maybe 50 years later had 50 bodies, etc. Mixes of men and women. So obviously, human sacrifice was a very important feature of Mississippi culture. The other thing that was a major feature of their culture is the ball game. Now, this is completely different than the ball game of Mesoamerican culture. All of these New World cultures are fascinated with sport. That is, sport is a metaphor for the movement of the heavens and the renewal of the earth. But they all had a different iteration of the sport, which was the compelling sport for them. The compelling sport, in the Mesoamerican sphere, you went around hitting this rubber ball with your hip through a hoop. The game here is chunky. And chunky is really an interesting game. It's part bowling and part lacrosse. It's spread out over a massive field, and you had not a ball, but a stone. And the stone would be thrown. And here we actually have an effigy pipe. So this is another one of these effigy pipes. The Hopewell effigy pipes have almost exclusively animals as their subject. But from this period, the effigy pipes are much larger. These like bookend-sized objects, also made out of pipestone. And they're generally human figures. And so in this case, this effigy pipe is a chunky player. And these are actually chunky stones. They are carved stones. And so the stone would be rolled out. And so you can imagine that this would be the opening play. That sets the location for other parts of the game. We're not entirely certain how it was played. There's been various efforts to reconstruct it. But we know that it had massive teams, and again, it had this cosmological significance. So all of this shows a world of kind of very complicated societies. And the fact that we find chunky stones, ball games, wood henges, courtyards, pyramid-like mounds at all of these major sites suggests that they had a kind of common culture. One of the things that we can look at is the iconography, and we can see this iconography in a lot of these things that we call gorgets. These are ornaments that are made out of shell, often made out of whelk shells. So these are coming from the coast, so they're import items. They would have been worn around the neck, and they're quite large, 3 to 4 inches in diameter sometimes. And we see images of spiders with crosses, but we also see spiral motifs, also with crosses. This is a pervasive motif. And we also see images of warriors. The warriors often have wings. They carry implements. This one carries a conch shell and also what appears to be a war club. So we have a number of varieties. Some of these figures are possibly identifiable. So this one is often been, now this one's been turned 90 degrees. So the gorget would have been attached by these two holes, but it's been turned upright so you can see. So we see a warrior carrying a head and a war club or mace, and he has a lot of finery. Some of the iconography here is really identifiable. He has this very striking marking on his face, and this appears to be an emulation of the markings on a peregrine falcon. So the peregrine falcon is a very important figure, and this is often associated with a character known as Redhorn or Morningstar. He's one of these cultural heroes. The story, coming again out of a lot of these upper Midwest Native American myths, is that you have a series of figures. You have Grandfather, who is a kind of creator god, who sends a number of envoys to the world to help create the world and set order in the world, and some of them go evil, some of them don't do so well, and Redhorn is one of these characters who's sent, one of the last characters who's sent. And he has a variety of names. When we look at this individual, though, we can see many of the characteristics associated with the culture. The war club, for example, we can actually find war maces made out of stone that look like this. He also has this elaborate headdress, and we find objects like this made out of hammered copper. So this appears, many people have interpreted this as two lungs together, but also as another motif that we see in the headdresses as well. And then we have these beautiful effigy pipes. So this is the effigy pipe. This one comes from the Spiro Mound. It's called the Resting Warrior, but most people believe that this is a representation of this cultural hero called Redhorn. He has a ceremonial stone disc in his elaborate headdress, and he has a very large braid that comes off the side of his head. This is why he's called Redhorn, because the braid would come off, and it was often ornately made, so it's like a horn coming off his head. The other feature is that he has these very elaborate earrings, and if you look at these earrings here, you can also see it on this one, they have a shape, and the shape is the shape of a face. And these are a very common feature that we see. We see them made in, again, copper and also in whelk shell. And these are what we call the long-nosed god or mascats, and they are ear decorations. Now, why is that significant? Because one of the titles given to Redhorn is he who has laughing faces in his ears. And he has these kind of magical earrings that have faces, and they often laugh or do things at inappropriate times. He's a bit of a trickster. He's a bit of a fun character, and oftentimes his earrings give him away. It's kind of interesting. So that is, again, another one of these things that connects it back up to this cultural hero, who is one of these people that's responsible for giving order to the universe. Now, he has two sons, and these two sons are often regarded as hero twins. And we often see pairs of figures. So here we have two warriors, either side of two pots with smoke rising from them. So these are braziers, or burning coals or incense of some kind. Here we have two warriors, and in this case the two warriors are on either side of a striped pole. The striped pole is the axis mundi. Notice there's that spiral motif in the center again. So these themes, again, show the order of the universe. The spiral pole is the axis mundi. It's the thing that gives us this sense, this thing that connects the underworld with the middle world and the overworld above. So, and all of these myths are still found in some of these later cultures, so it's kind of evidence that we really do have a continuation here. The other thing that we find are effigy pipes. So unlike the effigy pipes from the Hopewell period, which are small and little cute, adorable animals, these are usually figures. And they appear to be mythological figures. In this case, you can see that the pipe is blown with a reed pipe, is inserted into the back of the head, and the head is the bowl. These are quite massive. The small ones in the Hopewell period are relatively small, but some of these are quite massive. And this one is a very interesting one. This is called the Burger figure. This one was actually excavated at Cahokia. And this one shows a female figure. So you can make out her breasts. And she has a serpent which wraps around her. Now, the head would have been the bowl of the pipe, so it's unfortunately broken. But as we go around the figure, you'll notice that she is tilling the serpent. She has like a hoe that she is digging into the back of the serpent. And as you look around the back of the figure, the serpent blossoms into squash blossoms and gourds. So this is a story that, again, is known from Native American myth. There is this grandmother figure who kills a serpent, and from the serpent the earth is made. And so this appears to be a kind of iteration of the creation myth. So when we see these, these places where the iconography aligns with existing myth, it's a very strong assertion that these are in fact the same people. Some of these effigies are made out of stone. So here we see a couple of kneeling warriors, but generally they're going to be made again, well, they're all made out of stone, excuse me. Some of them are going to be made out of harder stone. These are made out of catlinite pipestone, and these are, I think, made out of limestone. We also have copper repousé, and so here we have, again, another elite warrior with a war club. Notice that same ornament in his hair, and he has wings. So when we look at these characters, they seem to be warriors and mythological characters, but they may also be a form of god impersonation. That is, this may be a representation of a performer in costume. So we also have ear spools. These are like gauges that would have been made for ears. We also have these stone slates that are palettes. We call these palettes that are ceremonial objects. And again, looking back at that figure of Redhorn, you'll notice he has one of these stone plates on his head, and the stone plate has what appears to be an eye. And so these are kind of ceremonial objects that were woven into headdresses. And so we see a common feature of these is, again, we have that striped pole. Notice also we have that kind of bilobed arrow, which people have interpreted as lungs, and then we also have hands with eyes. This is a very, very common element. So here we have two horned serpents. Horned serpents are a major feature of Native American culture in this region. And so the horned serpents are tied into knots, and they surround the hand emblem with eyes. So Mississippi culture thrived, and then there's a decline, and the decline is rather abrupt. In around the year 1300, which is an interesting date because that is the same date for the end of the Chaco Canyon cultures in the Ancestral Pueblo cultures, but it's also the end of the Terminal Classic in the Yucatan. We have a decline of Cahokia. So the year 1300 was a very bad year in North America. Something bad happened because we have a simultaneous decline of all of these cultures. Some of them, like the Ancestral Pueblo, just disappear, and then we only have fragments of these cliff dwellers that are much reduced from that time period. But others, like the Mississippi culture, it declined, but it does have a kind of late moment where it kind of pulls itself back together. But the Terminal Classic Maya utterly collapse as well. The descendants of these cultures appear to be the same people who become the Eastern Woodland Indians that we know as the Eastern Woodland Indians. And this is only from the northeastern section, but the southeastern section as well. These are the people who, again, lived in longhouses. So shortly after the arrival of Europeans on the continent, the Mississippi culture was still flourishing to a great degree, but by the year 1600, it's gone. When Hernando de Soto and Navarez went, they described cities, palisaded cities, stockades, rivers that were clear of reeds so they could be used as transportation. And within 50 years, Spaniards go back, and all of those cities are gone, and all they can find is small villages. The reeds have overtaken many of the smaller streams, so they can't be used as transportation hubs anymore. All of the great cities are gone, and all that's left are smaller villages. And the villages, of course, totally abandon mounds because those take large populations to maintain, and instead they start building longhouses. So the longhouse will become, the definitive form of architecture for all of these Eastern Woodland Indians in the post-classic period after the year 1600. They are most often made of wood and covered either with thatch or with bark. So this is bark stripped from trees. They would have a a fireplace in the center. They often had holes in the roof to allow the smoke and the light to come in, smoke to go out, light to come in, and they had raised benches on the sides. Some of the larger longhouses were quite large, and these are the kind of things that were seen when John Smith, of Pocahontas fame, first came to the New World, and he saw the Powhatan Indians living in longhouses. They would often have raised platforms on which would sit their chieftains. One of the features that does survive is the use of whelk or shells for the production of beads, and this is called wampum. Wampum just means beadwork in the language, but the beads could be used as a form of currency, but more importantly, they were often used as a testimonial to treaties. And so you would have these elaborately woven belts made out of shell beads that recorded historical events. The Iroquois Indians are famous for making wampum belts to record treaties and organizations. We also have some artifacts that survive. The Iroquois are very famous for these false faces. This is a very important shamanistic character in their tradition. There's a long story, but to sum it up short, when Grandfather, who's most often the creator god in most of these native traditions, creates the world, he goes around the world and he sees a strange character that he himself did not create. And he asks this character, "Who are you?" And he says, "Well, I'm the creator. I must be, because all of this wasn't here before me." And so they have a contest, and they have a contest to see which one of them is the true creator. And in the story, the stranger tries to summon a mountain, and he summons the mountain, and the mountain only moves a few inches. But the creator god is astonished, because even doing that shows that he has great power. Well, the creator god, just to show who's who, he summons the mountain, and he calls the mountain so quickly it smashes into the stranger's face, twisting his face. And so that's why these masks are twisted. And then he acknowledges he's not the creator, but he puts him in a position, and he says, "From now on you will serve my creations." And so these were used for rituals, shamanistic rituals, where individuals would put on these masks to represent these characters. Well, let's go to the American Southwest. So we have a number of cultures in the American Southwest, and we're going to talk about just a few of them. We have the Mogollon, the Hohokam, and the Fremont culture in Utah, but we also have the Ancestral Pueblo, more commonly known as the Anasazi, but the Anasazi is not the preferred term. That's actually a term applied to them by the Navajo. So the Mogollon are a group of individuals who live in southern New Mexico, but also cross over the Mexico border. The Nimbus branch of the Mogollon are actually known for their pottery. They live in cliff dwellings made out of rock, mortared together with mud, but it is their pottery that is really exquisite. That we have this beautiful black and white style pottery that's really very wonderful. The Hohokam are native to what is now basically the Phoenix Valley. So this area around here, where Phoenix is located, and the Hohokam have a little bit bigger cultures. The most famous example is Casa Grande, which here you can see under this modern awning, was a city made out of mud brick. This is very similar to what we see in the Pueblo area. This whole complex was a walled city, but this large structure here is what still survives, and this appears to be, again, a kind of citadel/temple. Here is a reconstruction of what the Hohokam settlement must have been like at Snaketown, and they too have a ball game. Again, we're not entirely certain of the mechanics of the ball game, but it has these two elliptical-like mounds on either side, and you can actually still see those in some of the areas. At the same time, Utah is home to the Fremont Indians. So the Fremont culture is probably not a single tribe. They're named for their finds on the Fremont River, which of course was named for the American West explorer, Captain Fremont. And so while they probably represented several different tribes, they're all recognizable mostly by their petroglyphs. So here at the Rochester Creek petroglyph panel, we have these massive panels of petroglyphs. This one has a variety of figures. One of the most common figures are these shaman-like figures that have what appear to be large headdresses. These are probably shaman dressed up in buffalo headdresses. This is under a rainbow. We know that in later Pueblo Indian cultures, rainbows are very important to their cosmology. There are a whole variety of these. There's the barrier style, where we see these painted figures that have these more elongated figures, but again, triangular profile and kind of horned heads. Some of these Fremont culture sites are very sophisticated. This is a sun wheel, and the sun wheel here has this large kind of diagram here, and you'll notice that there are holes set in the rock, and here a researcher has placed a stick in the rock to act as a kind of sundial. This has a high raking light, so the sun would fall across it, so the shadow would actually cross onto the sun wheel, indicating various astronomical events. So we know from recent research that a lot of these cultures, again, had very adept astronomical knowledge. And unfortunately, we don't have much from the Fremont culture other than these petroglyphs and a handful of pit houses. So pit houses were the main way of living. Again, the American Southwest is very dry and doesn't have a lot of wood. So if you're going to construct something, you have to construct it underground. And these became the kind of precursors to what we call a kiva. So the pit houses themselves are very simple. They're literal pits that have wooden beams that have earth piled on top of them. But they all have common features, and one of the common features they would have is they would have a ritualistic hole called a sipapu. The sipapu in a lot of these cultures is the hole that their ancestors came out of. And so what started as a simple house eventually became a kind of ritualistic environment. In a lot of Ancestral Pueblo myth and Hopi and Zuni myth, their ancestors ascended through many different underworlds. It's kind of very interesting. They came from the underworlds, and each underworld they passed into, they came up into the next one. And so the kiva being underground is kind of very evocative of that, and this represents their passage into the current world, or the current realm. These kivas, later kivas, were made with rock, and so it's entirely possible that the Fremont culture are the ancestors to a group that we call the Ancestral Pueblo. So the Ancestral Pueblo are more commonly called the Anasazi, but we don't call them the Anasazi because that is a name that was given to them by the Navajo. The Navajo are kind of late arrivals to the American Southwest, and Anasazi can be translated as foreigner or ancient enemy, which is not a positive thing. And so since these are definitely the ancestors to the modern day Pueblo, the Hopi and the Zuni, we prefer to call them the Ancestral Pueblo. Their main location was in Chaco Canyon. And there is evidence in their calendars and their religion of Mesoamerican influence. We'll talk about that. So Chaco Canyon is in modern day New Mexico, and it's a long kind of box canyon. But along the box canyon are a number of these massive pueblos. The pueblos are in fact quite gigantic and could have housed thousands of individuals, and they are walled structures. Most of them have a very common D shape. That is, that they will have an open courtyard with ceremonial kivas inside, and then they'll have an outside wall that is built that makes them self-contained. Here is one of them, for example. Here you can see this large ceremonial kiva, and you can see the remnants of the outer wall, and then this kind of block of living spaces. The kivas themselves are large and ceremonial structures. The kivas have features including niches in the wall that, again, we assume would have been used to mark out astronomical events. There's some evidence that, again, you have to remember these were covered by a roof, and the astronomical event would have allowed the light to pass through the center of the roof, and on certain days it would have eliminated certain niches, indicating that certain dates like the solstice or the equinox had passed. They also have large foot drums. These are structures that would have been covered with wood and then covered with a layer of earth, and so these cause resonance and echo when you dance on them. So they're ceremonial platforms for dancing. There's 11 of these in Chaco Canyon, and maybe they were all individual city-states, or maybe they were, one nation. It's hard to know. But Pueblo Bonito is probably the best preserved. And here you can see in the plan how it would have had this massive series of ceremonial kivas. Now, the largest kivas are probably, again, dedicated to specific gods or specific traditions. Much like other cultures, there are sacred societies that maintain the worships of the gods. But then you have this block of what would have been dwellings. Here you can see this would have been 5 or 6 stories tall. Several of the stories are still preserved. You can see just the scale of this person here. The wall of this thing is just gargantuan. Here you can see that inner floors would have been produced with beams. Lintels were made out of wood or large blocks of stone. Finely fit masonries. We also have these strangely shaped T-shaped doorways, which are characteristic of their architecture. All of this would have probably been covered over with a thick layer of stucco and earth. Now, at some of these locations, we find what appear to be kind of porticos, and they look like the kind of porticos we see at places like Palenque and elsewhere. That's a Mesoamerican feature. We also find Mesoamerican trade items like quetzal feathers in this location. So we know that they were linked by trade. It's possible that we would have seen other Mesoamerican influence. One of the more controversial findings is that there are trash heaps, and just like we have to have landfills, they had to have landfills, and they would bury their trash heaps, and they found human bones in the trash heaps. And in those human bones have evidence of what's called pot polish. That is, where you take an animal and you butcher the animal. It shows clear evidence of being butchered by a knife, and then you put that in a pot, and then you cook it down. The rubs on the edges of the pot, and it polishes the ends of the stone, and that's clear evidence that it's been cooked. Well, when they first found this, and they found evidence that these humans have been butchered, well, maybe you could say, well, maybe they died in war or something. Maybe they were criminals, but the pot polishing seems to indicate ritual cannibalism. Ritual cannibalism is not something we see terribly often in the North American sphere, but we do see it in the Mesoamerican sphere. And so there's a lot of suggestions that perhaps there's some kind of connection. Evidence of cannibalism was extraordinarily controversial when it was discovered, and of course you could imagine it was offensive to the descendants of the Ancestral Pueblo, the modern Pueblo Indians, but I think the evidence has been borne out that that's the case. And then we have another collapse. Just like the Maya collapse, all of these beautiful, magnificent pueblos with their incredible dry farming techniques come to a halt. And all of the major pueblos in Chaco Canyon are abandoned. And then instead what we see are cliff dwellings, particularly cliff dwellings such as Mesa Verde, which is a very prominent one. And we can see evidence of that. Here you can still see kivas. Now, what's funny is that when people think about the Anasazi, the Ancestral Pueblo, this is what first comes to mind. They don't consider those gigantic pueblos at the beginning. But this actually represents a much smaller and later phase of the Ancestral Pueblo. And they're moving into these cliff dwellings for defensive purposes. So some kind of terrible collapse happened around the year 1300. Their culture suffered some kind of societal collapse, and because we see this in every other region, have to assume it's got to be a drought or climate or disease or something like that. But this causes them to retreat up to the cliff walls, which are much more defensible. So it is important to remember that the Hopi and the Zuni are part of this Uto-Aztecan language group. So when I talked about the Aztecs, I mentioned that the Utes and the Paiutes that live in modern-day Utah are in fact Uto-Aztecan. They are ethnically and linguistically linked to the people from central Mexico. We see a number of similarities in their religion. God impersonation. If you go to Second Mesa today, Second Mesa is one of these it's a very difficult place if you're not an insider to get to. It is a place where the Hopi still practice the bean dance and their sacred dances, and they dress up in these elaborate outfits to represent their gods, the Kachina. So that's God impersonation, agricultural calendars and festivals, creation myths. This creation myths that are associated with going to the underworld or seeking power from the underworld, reverence for the four cardinal points, and then with the cannibalism, all of these things point to some kind of Mesoamerican connection. But we can't say for certain. So, of course, the Pueblo are still around. This is Oklahoma City. So the Pueblo are still around. They still exist. You have the Hopi and the Zuni, two different variations of it. And they still have a lot of cultural production, including Kachina dolls and Zuni ceramics, which are quite beautiful. So the Kachina we think of them as dolls and as kind of souvenirs, but the Kachina are actually representations of deities, of gods, that according to tradition lived on the San Francisco mountains. So the very rich cultural tradition. The other group that comes into the American Southwest are relatively recent newcomers. And these are the Dene, which we commonly call the Navajo, but also the Apache are part of this group. So they're Athabascan speakers. The Athabascan speakers are located up here in Alaska and the Yukon. They call themselves the Dene, which means the people. And somewhere 500 years ago or so, a group of them migrated down to the American Southwest. And they became what would be eventually we call the Navajo and the Apache, although the Navajo prefer to be called the Dene, the people. So they arrive right at the same time that horses and sheep are introduced to the American Southwest by Spaniards. They become very successful shepherds and pastoralists using horses and dogs to herd sheep, and of course the production of wool. And with the production of wool, they create these beautiful Navajo rugs. Now, these Navajo rugs are a weft-faced rug. That means that the horizontal weave is so tightly woven that you can't see the warp. That is the vertical part of the weave. And they were highly prized, even at the time, for shedding water, really being quite efficient and warm, and again, woven on these very traditional upright looms. The first phase of these are just use stripes or very simple geometric decorations. So the initial phase of Navajo rugs have this very simplified, striped delineation. As you go on, however, you start getting these much more complicated features. So this is what most people think of when they think of as a Navajo rug. But I love Navajo rugs because they're a prime example of the beauties and joys of cultural appropriation. So, wow. Up until about 1850, this is what Navajo rugs looked like. And then after 1850, they start to take on more complicated medallion-like shapes and geometric patterns. Why do they do that? Well, long story short, Mexico became a major source of rug weaving. Well, the standard for rug weaving was Middle Eastern rugs. Middle Eastern Turkic rugs were considered to be the highest quality, and so these styles of rugs were very, very popular in Europe. These styles get imported to Mexico from Europe with medallion-style rugs, and so Mexicans started making their own iterations of Middle Eastern rugs. These Middle Eastern-styled medallion rugs passed through Mexico. Then they go through one iteration, then they eventually pass through northern Mexico into the American Southwest, where the Navajos see them and they say, wow. And so they take that and culturally appropriate, but integrate it into their own tradition to create the beautiful Navajo rugs that we all know and love. It's kind of interesting. One of the other features of Navajo culture that I really wish I knew more about was sand painting. Sand painting, again, is a ritual form. Sand paintings were created as a form of divination to assess the intent of gods, etc. And they were always made temporarily to, divine the will of the god, but once they were done, they were destroyed. But they themselves became a major source of decoration. One of the other major groups of Native Americans that we know about are the Great Plains Indians. So these are the people who sweep into the territory after the pandemics, that we have the pandemics come into North America. We end up killing 85% of the population. Nobody really knows exactly how many people died, but this was probably the most devastating pandemic in the history of mankind. Native American peoples had no defenses against European diseases, and estimates of what North American populations were like, they can be as low as 25 million, but they can be as high as 80 million. Somewhere in the middle there is probably the truth, but 85% of those people died off. And so the vast interior of America, which had been, peopled and settled, agricultural communities, suddenly became unsettled. And so everything west of the Mississippi river system became new and open territory. And so we have a lot of tribes, most of which came out of the upper Midwest, who were semi-nomadic. And now, because they had the horse, which was introduced by Europeans, they became semi-nomadic cultures that could now spread out across the plains and, of course, hunt the buffalo. And we know that, it's funny, this is the culture that we most stereotypically identify as the Native American, the teepee-dwelling Lakota and Cheyenne and Crow, etc. And yet their period was a very short time period, just from about the 1650s to the 1870s. The Lakota came out of Minnesota and basically kicked the Cheyenne out of South Dakota and took those territories in the Black Hills. And so it's a culture of, it's a horse culture, nomadic horse culture, but it's very much a pillage culture of warring tribes as well. So the material culture that comes out of this is going to be things like decorated moccasins. We have a wide variety of decorated goods, including the teepee, the decorated teepee. Figural representation is not something that seems to have existed amongst the Great Plains Indians until they saw European art. And once they saw European art, they appropriated it immediately. So we have a whole tradition of what we call warrior painting amongst the Lakota and other tribes, where we have figures on horsebacks and also being painted onto teepees. One of my favorite traditions of this is the winter counts. A winter count every winter. These are semi-nomadic peoples, but they would come together to pool resources for the winter, and so every winter they would do a winter count, kind of inventory and kind of census of their people. They covered seasons from the first snow of the last winter to the first snow of the next winter, so that's how they counted the year. And each one of these panels then tells the story of each of the winter counts. And this is an amazing historical document which covers pretty much from about the late 18th century, the 1790s, all the way up into the early 20th century. So Aaron Bede was a Episcopalian reverend who actually took this, and this is High Dog. High Dog was the chieftain. This was a member of the Dakota peoples, and he got him to interpret this for. So it's interesting, as you can see, that Europeans show up with their funny hats in various places, and it's an amazing kind of, again, not fully writing, but a series of mnemonic devices of recording your people. Really neat stuff. I want to close out North America then with the Pacific Northwest, because, again, this is... I always feel like I give people short shrift when I give North America. I'm not a North American expert. So you're like, no kidding. We could tell. But there are a few traditions that I just want to touch on, particularly the wood carving traditions of the Pacific Northwest. So along the Pacific Northwest in America and Canada, we have a number of these coastal First Nations, the Tlingit, the Haida, Kwakiutl, and they, of course, are living in areas that have lots of wood, cedar trees, and so they have a very rich tradition of carving, the carving of totem poles and lodges with a series of representations. Here is a historical photo that can show you this. What I love about this is you have a face here, but the face actually has faces inside of the eyes that themselves have representations. So really kind of incredible series of carving. And one of my favorite traditions is the tradition of mask carving. So this is a Tlingit eagle mask on the left, and this is a Haida maiden mask on the right. And they also had ritual performances, and in those ritual performances they would wear masks that again would identify them with their mythological figures or their gods. But one of the most beautiful traditions of this is the transformation mask. Many of these cultures had traditions of figures such as Raven. Raven is a very important mythological character in the Pacific Northwest who's kind of a trickster god, but also a benevolent kind of god who watches over humans. And he, like many of the characters in Native American myth, can take on human form or appear in a different form. And so to accommodate this mythology, they would build these beautifully carved masks that were transformation masks. So this one shows an older woman that can then transform into a younger, beautiful maiden. This beautiful abalone lip labret, where she has this lip piece that's placed in abalone shell. And so this thing could open up. This is probably the most famous of all the transformation masks. This one, of course, represents an eagle, and as the face splits, the eagle opens up and to reveal the face of the spirit inside. This one is famous because this was in the collection of a museum and was used as the basis for the Seattle Seahawks. So there you go. A little bit of NFL trivia. There you go. You know, if you could see it as the basis of this kind of decoration. And that will close out North America, but I did want to touch briefly on the Caribbean. The Caribbean, of course, is the first culture to be encountered by Europeans in the New World. So it is on the island of Hispaniola that Columbus first sets foot, and these are the first people to kind of encounter European culture and also the European pandemics and European slavery. So I did want to talk a little about the Taino Indians and some of the cultures that existed. They too had a ball game. And remember, the Caribbean is not that far from the Yucatan. The Yucatan juts up into the Caribbean, and so many people assume that maybe there is a connection. So they had these ceremonial courts or ball courts for performances. They are often have totemic figures around the outside that are characteristic to the Taino people. One of the other things that's characteristic of the Taino people is the chemi. The chemi is an ancestral figure or totem, sometimes carved of wood, but most often carved out of stone, and is a kind of phallic symbol representing the power of the god, the chemi or the zemi figure as it exists. We'll close out there. Again, so many cultures to talk about, and we just have to move forward. So we will close out there, and when we come back, we will start up with Asia. Thanks so much. See you next time.